I've been looking forward to this afternoon's speaker. I've read his stuff. I keep up with what's happening in the world of cultural trends, largely because I pay attention to Ryan Burge. He is an associate professor at Eastern Illinois University, holds a PhD from Southern Illinois University, political scientist, sociologist, practitioner, and a pastor. Understands institutions like ours, organizations like ours, has his finger on the pulse of cultural trends in this country like few others. His work on the nuns is a book that I think you must read. His book, 20 Myths About Religion and Politics, is simply outstanding. And in just about a month, the book that is coming with great preview affirmations related to it, The American Religious Landscape. I already have it ordered and can't wait to read it once it is released. We heard from some of his friends who talked to us last year about the great dechurching, and he did some of the research that was behind that book, but we are happy to have him here this year to help us understand some of the issues and trends and challenges that are out there that affect all of us on our campuses and our organizations. So Ryan, we're so thankful that you have come. Join me, please, in welcoming here to the IACE podium.
Well, first, I've got to say that I'm a product of Christian education. I went to Greenville College, now Greenville University, which annoys me because I have to say that twice to everybody now, how they changed their name. But I got into ministry because I went to Greenville. I was a college student who went to youth group a bunch in high school, and I didn't have a summer job, and I was sitting in a philosophy of youth ministry class, and my professor, Dr. Bruce Cromwell, said, I know a church in Centralia, Illinois, that's looking for a youth ministry intern. And I said, okay, I'll apply. It's supposed to be 3 months. Ended up being 3 years, and that led to my first pastor at a little church in Marion, Illinois. I was there for a year, and then I was asked to preach at a little church in Mount Vernon, Illinois, First Baptist Church. I started there in 2006. I preached once. They said, will you come back and preach again? I said, yes. They said, will you come be our interim pastor? And I said, sure. And I was there for 17 and a half years. Our church closed in July of 2024. So there's a straight line in my mind between sitting in that Christian environment when I was 19 years old and where I ended up at 42. So you guys are at such a critical part of people's lives. Their trajectory changes so dramatically between 18 and 22. And I would not be doing what I'm doing right now if it wasn't for the formative experience I had at Greenville, where I got the academic rigor, but I also got the exposure to real, thoughtful Christians working at a very high level. And I realized those two things were not incompatible with each other. Academic rigor and Christianity can go hand in hand. So a lot of what I do is trying to explain the world, and I wanted to focus today on the students that are sitting in your classrooms. A huge focus on Gen Z today. Do you guys know the oldest members of Gen Z will turn 30 years old next year? We have to stop thinking about Gen Z as like 15, 16, 17-year-olds. 1996 or later is when Gen Z was born. So they're getting up there. I mean, they're moving into middle adulthood. Look at this picture, by the way. Hold on, go back. Ooh, look at that AI. You guys like that? I don't know if Gen Z looks like that or not, but there they are. Let's just start by showing you what the religion of Gen Z looks like. By the way, if you don't like graphs, I'm so sorry. I'll try to make it interesting, but I do graphs. That's my love language. I don't know how to do talks without graphs, so let's go. So this is the religious composition of a bunch of generations going back to the silent generation. Obviously, the silent generation is not around a whole lot anymore, born between 1925 and 1945. So, they're reaching their heavenly reward. The boomers, can I give you a fun fact about the boomers? There are baby boomers who gave birth to baby boomers. Did you guys know that? 1946 to 1964 is the stretch. So if you were born in 1946 and had a baby at 18, your baby was also a baby boomer. That's how big that generation is just in terms of like length of time. They are, you can see here, they're about 60% Protestant Catholic, okay? And then about 28% non-religious. And then you go down to Gen X, which is, everyone goes, we're the forgotten generation. And sorry guys, you are. This is the last time I'm going to talk about you the entire presentation. Maybe, I don't know. You can see that they're slightly less religious than the boomers are. You can see that kind of cascade, right? Like the bars cascade down. They're 32% Protestant and 19% Catholic. And then the nun share is about 34% of Generation X are non-religious. And then you get to millennials. And what I really want to point out, and this is a point I'm going to make over and over again today, is you see how much difference there are between silents and boomers and X and millennials, and then how little difference there are between millennials and Gen Z. That's a really important point that I want to drive home here is there's always been this huge religious drop-off from one generation to the next, and it didn't happen between millennials and Gen Z. There still is a drop-off. Don't mishear me here. But it's incredibly small compared to the prior generations, okay? So for instance, about 42% in this sample of Gen Z are atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. It's 42% of millennials, exactly the same percentage, okay? Now, the difference is really a little difference on the Protestant side, down 3 points, and then the other world religions, that's like Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, people who fit in those other categories, they're up 2 points. But that's really the only difference between Gen Z and millennials. That's a big deal, guys, because religion has been declining in America now for 30 years, and it looks like things have changed. So let me show you. What did I do? Did I mess up? What did I do? Okay, look. This, when I made this graph for the first time, I had a holy cow moment sitting there at my desk. My wife ran in and goes, what happened? I go, the numbers are different. I didn't expect them to do this. Because I've been doing this work since 2005. And the perception is the nuns line goes up every year. That's just how we assume things are going to happen. But if you break it down by generation, what you see is that it's different by generation now. So for boomers, 65, remember 1946, 1964, the nuns are continuing to rise among baby boomers, okay? It's still gone from, it was 17% in 2008, it's 28% today. Every year or two it rises by a point or two. So the line keeps going up. Now look at, I'm going to talk about Gen X. I apologize for you guys. Here you are. 25, 31, 33, 34, 35, 34. Those last 3 years are statistically the same. Looks like Gen X has hit a plateau around 35%. Now, look at millennials. 33, 37, 38, 43, 44, 42. We're going over the hill now. And look at Generation Z. We don't have any data from them before 2016 because they weren't old enough to be polled because they were kids, okay? 39, 45, 48, 42. Now, I would not bet the farm on it's actually 42. It's one survey, 1 year, okay? So let's not over-extrapolate from one data point. The new version of the 2024 CES is going to come out in probably the next 6 weeks, which will be my Christmas and New Year's and Easter all rolled into one day. It'll be fantastic. But I fully expect to see that the Gen Z number will not be 48%. It will, there's been a crest. And I think this is probably one of the biggest religion stories going right now is that the rise of the nuns has stopped. For 30 years, between 1990 and 2020, we saw this unbelievable rise in non-religion. It went from 5% to about 30% between 1990 and 2020. I think we're going to look back in American history, American religious history, and say that was a specific period of time, and that will not continue after 2020. Now, hear me carefully, though. I am not saying there's a massive religious revival going on in America. Do not misunderstand what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the rise of the nuns. Think about it like this. Google in the first 3 years, 4 years was just exploding with revenue growth. And then they grew 6% a year and 5% a year. We're in that part of the nuns rising. And here's why. Because the people at the top part of that graph are dying, being replaced by people at the bottom part of that graph. So boomers, 28% are dying, being replaced by 42%. So that's going to make the number go up, but a lot slower than it did 20 years ago. We're in a different era of American religion. And you can see this. So this is birth year across the bottom. I'm showing you 4 surveys. This is the share of each birth year that were nuns in those 4 different surveys. Do you see how flat those lines are? It might be rising too. Think about this. I was born in 1982. I had kids in 2011 and 2014. The religiosity of my kids might be 3 or 4 points different than the religiosity I grew up with. Think about that for a minute. It's never been that way. It's always been this huge gap between parents and children in terms of religion. Anything that we've heard from youth ministry folks well, the new generation, you've got to minister to them differently. When it comes to religion, whatever millennials are up to, Gen Z's up to. There's just not that much difference between these 2 generations, which is a big deal. It means that the gap, for instance, between your professors, your younger professors in the classroom, and your students is not that big. When it was big 20 years ago and 30 years ago and 40 years ago, it's not that big anymore. There's much more connective tissue and relational tissue between someone in their early 40s and someone in their early 20s now. And that's something we really need to think about. But here's the bigger picture that we can't ignore. This is great data. It's called Monitoring the Future. University of Michigan surveys 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders every year and ask them a bunch of questions about all kinds of stuff, which is a great way to see where America's going. They've been asking since 1976 how often they attend religious services. This is the bad news, okay? In 1976, the most popular response option was weekly. About 38% of high school seniors were attending church every week, and the share who were never attending was about 12 or 13%. Very low, okay? So for every never attender, there were at least 3 weekly attenders. Church going was rampant amongst 12th graders. But then you see that weekly line just drop and drop. And then it hits this weird plateau that I think I want to think more about, mid-1990s to early 2000s. And then you see it turn down again. So now the share of American high school seniors who attend church weekly is about 18%. That's the bad news. There's just not that many high school students going to church anymore. And even if you add the monthly to it, you're only getting to about 1/3 of 12th graders are attending church at least once a month. So for every monthly plus attender, you've got 2 high school students who are attending seldom or never. It's definitely not a religious generation in any way, shape, or form. Now, here's what's fascinating, though. I also love this because they asked the high school students what their average grade was in class. This is something that I write about a lot, probably too much. It's become just overwhelming in my mind of how strongly the relationship is between education and church attendance. Let me tell you this as clearly as I possibly can. In the United States, people with graduate degrees are the most likely to attend religious services on a weekly basis. People who didn't finish high school are the least likely. There's a positive relationship between education and church attendance. You see it in multiple data sources. You see it across time, and you see it in this data source too. Among high school seniors, the type of high school senior that's the most likely to be in church every week is a student who's an A student. And that's been true for the last 45 years. The least likely students are students who are doing poorly in their classes. Now, obviously, all the lines are dropping, yes. And actually, the bigger drop, unfortunately, is among the A students. It was 54% were attending weekly, and now it's 26%. So the gap used to be 34 points between the top and the bottom on grades, and now it's just 14 points. But even today, the type of student that's the most likely to be in church is the type of student who's doing well in school. Doing well begets doing well. Dropping out begets dropping out. That's what we know about social science. There's actually a whole raft of evidence now that says that religious kids do better in school than non-religious kids once you control for other things like income, having two-parent households, race, all those things. Religious kids tend to do better in school than non-religious kids, which means your students should be pretty good compared to my students at Eastern Illinois University. Okay, so this is like the whole graph, and I broke it down. So here's your A students in the top left, B students top right, C students here, and then D students over here. Among A students, weekly attendance was the most popular response option among A students for the last 40 years. It just changed right around 2018 or so. But you can see, every one of these graphs looks different. And notice something. Look at the C and D graphs. The C students have never gone to church that much, and the D students have definitely never gone to church that much. Guess who's the most likely to be a never attender? Students getting bad grades. Guess who's the least likely to be a never attender? Students getting A's. Okay? Don't want to belabor this point too much, but there's a strong relationship between how well you're doing in one aspect of life and how well you're doing in other aspects of life. Okay? So, what I did here was make a heat map. I love heat maps. They're like my favorite. This is what I talk about with my friends, by the way. Man, I made this heat map. You wouldn't believe it. But I love this because it shows you religion on two dimensions. Okay? So it's religious importance across the bottom, and that goes from not important at all to very important. And then up and down the left side is a religious attendance. So the top right corner, that is the share of high school seniors who said religion was very important to them and they attended every week. In 1976, that was 27% of all high school seniors were in the top right corner. So the most religious you could be, 27%. Okay? The bottom left corner is people who never attended church and said religion's not important to them at all. 6%. Okay? So you're talking about 4.5 times more people here than here. And you're still, look at this. You got 43, you got 54% of the sample are in that top right corner, the religious, pretty religious and pretty active, okay? Now compare that, though, to our 2022 numbers, and you can see that the 6% now becomes 17%. So now they're 3 times as likely to be as irreligious as you possibly could be. High school seniors are 6% to 17%. And then this drops in half, 27% down to 14%. There's no doubt that a high school senior today is much less religious. The average high school senior today is much less religious than the average high school senior from 40 years ago. There's just no other way to look at the data. It's just a totally different religious environment for these young people that looks completely alien to someone born in the 1970s. I'm going to show you data in a minute that makes you think a lot differently about the 1970s, by the way, because it's not what you think it is. These are not a bunch of like holy roller Bible thumpers rolling around in America in 1976. In some ways, they were actually worse than the current high school students. But on this measure, they're definitely more religious in 1976 than they are today. Okay. Second trend that I want to point out, and this is a big deal, okay? For decades, social science has known, and I'm using known in air quotes here, that women are more religious than men. It's just one of those like truisms in social science. It extends to almost every country on earth. It extends back over time. Pew wrote a whole report about it. My favorite line was, "We don't really know why this is true. We just know it is true." Like no one has been able to like isolate why this is the case, but the data is clear on this, that women have consistently been more religious than men. And the gap's not huge, but it's there, and it's consistently there. But things have changed in the last couple of years. And this is a huge story in that young men might be more religious than young women. Might be. I'm not 1,000% here yet, but I think the data is pointing us in that direction. So here's the graph that got it all started for me. So this is the share who are non-religious by gender and birth year. So people born in 1940 are over here, people born in 2000 are over there. And you can see up here, look how big that gender gap is. Men were much more likely to be nuns than women. Like this is around my people, born around 1980. It's only about 31% of women, it's about 41% of men. That's a huge gap. Okay, that's exactly what we expect. But then you look over time and you see, okay, the gap's still there here, and it's still there here, but notice how it's starting to narrow right here in the youngest part of the sample. Oh, we see it here. Oh, okay. And then look here, and you also see it here too. The gap in the nuns, it used to be that men were more likely to be non-religious than women, but amongst the youngest part of the sample now, the data is converging on this central thesis that the God gap has disappeared. The gender God gap has disappeared. You can see it here. This is the General Social Survey. This is share who are nuns by gender, and I'm taking this all the way back to 1990. This is 18 to 25-year-olds, so your students. Look here. 3-point gap, 3-point gap, 3-point gap, okay. Well, that's interesting. What we're seeing is the line for men continues to rise, but much more slowly. But look at the line for young women. Boom, look at that. Continuing to rise. And you're seeing this in the discourse. There's actually a huge debate in social science now whether young women are moving very far to the left politically, while young men have not moved at all. And I think that these two ideas are linked together, that political liberalism is seen by young women as being incompatible with religion in America because they assume that religion in America is inherently conservative. And young women are fleeing from that. We can talk in the Q&A about why I think that is. I don't have a great answer yet, but I've got some speculation about why I think that's happening. You also see it, this is data from the American Enterprise Institute. Just show you this is not just me, it's everyone's finding this. Look, we're seeing, so this is women, 39% of Gen Z are nuns, it's 34% of millennials, right? So the numbers continue to rise. Look at this. They have 37% of millennial men being nuns and only 34% of Gen Z men being nuns. Now the gap is 5 points, guys. Women are 5 points more likely to be non-religious, young women, than young men are. This got written up in the New York Times, and it became a whole thing. And I have to say, I had a hand in doing that because I think it's a big story worth talking about. There was a spate of stories in the New York Post and other outlets about how young men are flocking to the Orthodox Church, which I don't really think that's happening in a systematic way, by the way, but it's a good story to tell because it goes in part of the larger narrative. Men are flocking to traditional Catholicism, to evangelicalism. They're actually flocking to what we call hard religion, not easy religion. Religion that demands a lot of you, right? So really high intensity types of religion. And here's one more graph about this. So this is attending weekly. Obviously, look at how much older people attend weekly and look where it bottoms out. Men who are the least likely to attend church are born in the early 1970s. Who would have thought? That's the least religious version of men, is the early 1970s. But look here. You see what we see here, the blue line? A rebound in weekly attendance among men born after 1980. What do you see for women? The line comes down and just flattens out. That's a big deal. Again, we're not used to this. And you see on never attending, look at this. The share of men who are never attending has dropped, while for women, it stayed flat. That right there is something worth talking about, especially in a Christian higher education context, because we know in we know in general in higher education, men are not going to college. might be one of the biggest stories in higher education right now is a lot of colleges are struggling to even get a 60-40 ratio. Some are 2-to-1. Well, guess what? Christian colleges, you might actually benefit from this. Young men might be interested in coming to a Christian college because they're coming back to faith, and they might be looking for a Christian college. The secular universities are the ones that are going to struggle, I feel like. We're going to continue to have these problems. In a lot of my classes, it is 2-to-1. We're going to do some affirmative action, getting more men in the classroom because they're not showing up. They're not applying. And it's a problem. I think we're all embracing the idea that it's good to have a gender mix in the classroom. I think Christian colleges are actually going to struggle with this less because of this gap switching. I think Christian men are going to want to come to Christian colleges. But I'm not 1,000% convinced that it's as big as I think it is. I'm always like toying around with them. Am I wrong? That's a question that I ask myself all the time. What am I wrong about? Am I wrong? This is a question about religious importance. I want to point out two things here. I want to show you, this is millennials and Gen Z. Notice how that 27% of millennial men say religion is very important, and 27% of Gen Z men say religion is very important. But look here, 28% of Gen Z men say it's somewhat important, which is 4 points higher than millennial men. It looks like millennial men are slightly less religious than Gen Z men are, slightly, maybe 2 or 3 points. But look at women here. This is women. 30% of millennial women say religion's very important, 27% here. But look at the gaps, by the way, in these 4 different groups. Almost non-existent. Remember I told you that millennials and Gen Z are very similar? This is more evidence of the fact that like there's not this huge drop-off in religion between people born in 1980 and people born in 2000. They're almost exactly the same now, which is a very big deal. But I think this might be the most important characteristic when it comes to Generation Z. They are the safest, least social generation in American history. And I think this is a tough conversation to have because I'll give you some data, you're like, that's good, but then the more you think about it, you go, that might not be so good. You know, there's some behaviors that are different in Gen Z than millennials that are troubling, I think, in many ways, for Christians and non-Christians, for America, really. So, this is a question about socialization. It comes from the Census Bureau is asking really good questions recently, and they have a different product. They're asking people questions about not just like how many people live in your house, but like other things. The question is, how often do you get together with friends or relatives on a weekly basis? First off, Gen X, you guys are some lonely folk. 45% of Gen X says they don't get never, 0 times a week do they get together with friends or family. And another 37% says they do it once or twice. And millennials are really close. They're actually statistically the same. Gen Z is 75% of Gen Z gets together with their friends no more than 2 times a week. Which I'm telling you right now is not going to get better as they age. As a guy who's 42 years old right now, it's hard to hang out with people when you're 42 because you got to like schedule and calendar and my kid's sick and all that kind of nonsense. It's easy to hang out when you're 25. It is not easy to hang out when you're 35 or 40. So while they look okay here, I'm telling you, this is as good as it gets for Gen Z. It's going to get worse from here. And I'm almost certain they're going to be more socially isolated in 10 or 15 years than millennials ever thought about being. They're not hanging out. You know who hangs out the most? Old folks. I wish I had time to hang out. That'd be fun. Someone asked me one time, "What's your hobby?" I go, "I don't know. I just go to work." I don't have hobbies. Who has time for hobbies anymore? But it's true, and you can see the boomers. And there's other questions I ran on this, like who talks on the phone the most? You know who talks on the phone the most? Boomers talk on the phone all the time. You know who doesn't talk on the phone? My generation. Don't call me for God. No, text me. I don't want to talk to anybody on the phone. But here's where it gets really, really troublesome. they ask you, how often do you attend meetings of clubs or organizations per year? Per year, not per week or per month, per year. And this is birth year across the bottom. Think about this. Someone born in 2000, so they were 24 years old when the survey was taken. 2/3 of them are part of 0 clubs. 0 clubs. And let's see, about 17% said they attended a club or organization meeting at least once a month. I mean, you guys know a guy named Robert Putnam? Wrote a book called Bowling Alone like 25 years ago. Whatever Putnam saw 25 years ago, we have not fixed at all. You know, Bowling Alone, the entire thesis is we're not bowling in bowling leagues anymore. We're bowling by ourselves. We're not joining the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and the Moose and the Elks and the VFW and the American Legion and all the social organizations that hold us together. If you wrote Bowling Alone today, it'd be called Tweeting Alone or Facebooking Alone or Instagramming Alone or TikToking Alone or Snapchatting Alone. And what's funny about Putnam is, you know what he blamed for this lack of community? Cable television. Isn't that cute? Now we have 1,000 different ways to entertain ourselves beyond cable television, and young people are not joining clubs. And as a political scientist, I can tell you that social capital is the most important thing in America, and we're not generating it anymore because we're not joining organizations. It's a fact. I wrote a whole book about it. It's coming out next year with Brazos. It's basically how we don't have engines of social capital anymore, how we hate each other because we don't hang out with each other. You know, I was amazed. When I went to grad school, I was like, I hope this is like undergrad. Because I went to Greenville, which is like a very small, I knew everybody on campus. And I go to grad school, I'm like, this is like going to a job. I don't know any of you people. You know, I wanted that community again. I think for the rest of my life, I will want to return to the community that I had when I was 21 years old. And I will never be able to do it. And I think young people don't hear that story very much, by the way. And here's what happens when they become adults. They don't join anything. I was part of like 20 clubs in college, everything I was part of, and then I stopped joining anything. And then we're worse for it, and they're worse for it, and democracy's worse for it, and your community's worse for it. We're worse for it. And then how often do you attend religious services in the last year? Not month, not week, year. In this one survey, about 2/3 of people born in 2000 said they had not darkened a church's door in the prior 12 months. 2/3. Socialization begets socialization. Hanging out begets hanging out. I had a whole conversation. We have friends who have a son who's 17, 18, going to go to college. I go, hey, when you go to college, leave your door open when you're in the room, in your dorm room, to let people like walk by and hang out. He goes, you do that? Yeah, you do that. That's how you get through college, is people come and hang. It's like young people have no concept of like just how to like have random meetups. You know what I mean? Just hang out. The brains are broken. I tell them that all the time. Your brain's broken, man. You need to go hang out somewhere. Just do something. But, here's the good news. Maybe, probably not, but maybe. Young people are not doing drugs. Yay. It's really fascinating like how much alcohol, cigarettes, and marijuana have declined over time. Like, we're like, these kids these days are all vaping and smoking weed. No, they're not. That's false. What you're saying is demonstrably, empirically false. That there's no universe is what you're saying true. No universe. Look at this. The share of high school seniors in 1976 who had ever used alcohol in their lifetime was 92%. So they were going to church, but they were drinking on Saturday night before they went. Okay? Almost all of them were drinking alcohol. Statistically, almost all of them were drinking alcohol. Almost all of them. And now that number is 53%. Half of high school seniors have never tasted alcohol in their lives. Not last week or last month, ever. Just think about that. When we talk about the kids these days, the kids these days, half of them don't drink when our generation was dying in a field somewhere of alcohol poisoning. Like, it is not the same at all. Look at cigarettes. This might be one of the greatest triumphs of public health ever. I went to high school in 1996 to 2000. Every kid went over to the gas station and were smoking cigarettes on the sidewalk when we left. They'd smoke out the window of the bathroom between classes because they had to get their nicotine fix. And by the way, I did look about vaping. Not that many kids vape either. It's like 25%. So it's not like they're switching cigarettes for vaping. The number of young people, the percentage of young people who are consuming nicotine is lower today than it's ever been. And even marijuana. Weed, 64%. Look, man, what were kids in the 70s up to? They were all drinking, they were all smoking, they were all doing weed, and now it's about 38% of high school seniors have ever tried marijuana. And that's the same, by the way, with all the legalization and all the proliferation of legal marijuana in America, it's had no impact on the number of young people who are actually consuming marijuana. It's the same today as it was 20 years ago. 38%. Kids today are engaging in illicit activities at significantly lower rates than they were 30 years ago and 40 years ago. They are the safest generation in American history. And you add it all together, this is what I call my straight edge graph. You guys know what that means? In the punk scene, it was people who didn't smoke or drink or do drugs. You would mark a big black X on your hand, meant you were straight edge. So you went to a bar, you're like, oh, I'm straight edge, it's good. No alcohol for me. This is the share of high school seniors who have not smoked, drank, or done marijuana in the prior 30 days. It was 5% of high school seniors in 1976 had not done any illicit activity. So 95% of seniors had done at least one of those things. You know what it is today? Almost 40% of high school seniors are completely straight edge. An 8 times increase. 40% of kids entering your freshman class next year will have never smoked, never drank, and never done marijuana. Unbelievable how much progress we've made on these things. But it's not probably all great news. It's probably not. And this is weird saying to a Christian audience, but listen, I think a few of us probably sowed our wild oats in high school a little bit and did some dumb things that we maybe regret, but also had a good time while we were doing it. You know, in the Amish culture, they have something called Rumspringa, where it's like you grow up real tight, real controlled in this very strict environment, right? And then you get to a certain age, like, go out and do whatever you want and then come back. Because they understood something, right? Which is that we all have this desire to go, like, blow it out for a while, do dumb things, and then return to what we came up with. You can't be controlled all the time, apparently, unless you're a high school senior right now. And I just wonder what the long-term implications of such a thing are on their future. This is, by the way, if you think it's because of religion, you're wrong. Like, oh, it's because the religion's having... This is something the church needs to think about very significantly is, as religion declined precipitously among young people, so did alcohol usage, so did cigarettes, so did marijuana. So it's not the influence of the church. Your youth pastor ain't getting kids off drugs. That's what the data says. Religion declined, and so did alcohol consumption, cigarette consumption, and marijuana consumption at the same time. So these are students who attend weekly. This is, have you ever had any alcohol in your life? A weekly attender is only about 5 points less likely to drink alcohol than a never attender now. That's the difference between a kid who goes to church every week and a kid who never goes to church. 5% difference in alcohol consumption. That's it. So it's not church that's keeping people away from alcohol. That is not what's happening. Which really needs to be a reckoning, I think, for, I grew up evangelical in the 1990s, man. We were told, don't drink, don't swear, don't smoke, don't have sex. And it seemed like it had really no effect on anything. The data, if you want more data like this, I recommend a great book by Jean Twenge called Generations. She digs deep into all these things, and she's finding out that young people are less likely to have sex before they get married. They're less likely to get a driver's license at 16 years old. They're less likely to get a full-time job at 16 or 18 years old. You know what they're doing? They're delaying their lives. That's what they're doing. And I think we can all say it's probably teen pregnancy rates in America have dropped by 75% over the last 30 years. That's a good thing. Teen sex is probably bad, but when kids are not smoking, they're not drinking, they're not doing cigarettes, they're not having sex, they're not getting jobs, they're not dating, what are they doing with their lives? those are the kind of kids who are in your classrooms now, who have done really nothing, have not lived their lives in a way that 20 or 30 years ago we did. And this is the end result. This is from Jean Twenge. This is Monitoring the Future, this data set I was talking about from her book, Generations. I cannot believe that it's an unalloyed good that marijuana usage is down and cigarette smoking is down. I cannot believe that, because you know what else is not down? Depression, anxiety, loneliness. They're not doing those things because they're not hanging out with people. That's what high school kids did 30 years ago, was hung out and smoked cigarettes and drank beer. And they're not doing that anymore. They're not dating. They're afraid to ask girls on dates because they might get made fun of, or they might get posted on Snapchat. I didn't get to put this slide in because I just saw this graph on Twitter yesterday. They asked Gen Z, what do you desire the most in life? And it was like things like being wealthy, having a meaningful job, having a good family. You know what scored number one out of everything they ask? Being safe. That was the number one thing that Generation Z is seeking in this world, is being safe. I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis's famous quote from the Chronicles of Narnia. He was asked, one of the characters asked about Aslan. Is he safe? No, but he's good. Safe is not always good. It's not. And I think we need to really think significantly about what that means when these students are 25 and 35 and 45 who have never done anything, not lived their life, not blown it out, not made bad decisions they regret. What are they going to do that when they're 45? Are they just going to not do it at all? You have to draw a straight line between all. These are good things, but they're also bad things. There are negative things that are happening with Generation Z that we need to be very mindful of. So some takeaways. One, I think that Generation Z is the least religious generation in American history, but they're not that much religious than the millennials are. You got to take both things together there, right? It's bad, but it could be worse. They're not that irreligious. And actually, there might be some evidence that they're coming back to religion, maybe slowly. The second thing is the gender gap has disappeared. Young women are not more religious than young men, and that's a very big deal for all kinds of reasons, and even including things like fertility down the road, marriage rates down the road. There's all kinds of things that go along with that we haven't even begun to explore yet. And the third thing is the substance use of Gen Z is incredibly low, but so is the rate of socialization. I think there's the growing amount of evidence about Generation Z makes me worried about them. They have an AirPod in their ear all the time now. I don't think that's good. I'll tell you a story that might give you some hope, though. My 10-year-old, I have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. My 13-year-old has a phone, so please yell at me later about why that's a bad idea, but he goes to middle school and they need to call after practice and stuff. My 10-year-old does not have a phone. He has a tablet. It's big. It's a tablet, I go, Reed, do you want to take the tablet when we go to a restaurant? Do you want to take the tablet? He goes, no, I don't want to be an iPad kid. I don't want to be, you get what he's saying, right? He doesn't want to be that kid sitting there staring at YouTube while other people are talking at the table. So the older kids will be on their phones at the table and he'll just be sitting there. And I'm like, I don't know what I did to that kid, but he figured it out. I hope there are a lot more kids like my 10-year-old who realize that staring at your phone all day is not socialization, that social networks are not real, that this is real. Being with people is the realest thing you can do. And social science has been clear on this. Online church is not nearly as good as in-person church. Online gathering is not nearly as good as in-person gathering. What you guys do in creating a residential college campus is one of the greatest things that we can possibly do as a functioning society. It's one of the last bastions of socialization. And I do think that every one of us needs to be more mindful about how to change the mentality of Generation Z, saying, put your phone down, take your AirPod out, and talk to another human being. It will be okay. And you might end up doing a few dumb things that you don't like, but you know what? At the end of the day, it's probably worth it for all of us. So I'm going to stop. I'm sure there'll be no questions at all. But if there are, there's microphones there and there if you'd like to ask a question or two. Okay, go.
All right, so the chart I was waiting on.
Uh-oh. I didn't give it. The one you wanted, I didn't give you, huh?
What about pornography use?
Yeah. So everyone lies about it. That's actually the answer. Is there's so much lying about it that it's almost. So my most famous post in all my Substack history was the data is clear. People are having less sex. People are having less sex too. Even married people are having less sex now than married people were 30 years ago. I think porn is part of it, but I also think phones are part of it too. And I don't know how to pull those two pieces apart, right? Some people look at porn on their phone, some people don't. But I think, here's the thing about sex. People had sex because they were bored. I mean, let's just be honest here, right? When you're 50 years ago, you didn't have many ways to entertain yourself. It's like, well, Now it's like you got Netflix and you got Snapchat. You got ways to distract yourself. I think, to me, it's the distraction piece more than anything else, more than the porn piece. Not that I don't think porn's a problem. I do think it's a problem. I just don't think if we got rid of porn, then all these problems would get solved. Yeah.
One of your charts, I think it was you were talking about the irreligiosity of young women.
Yeah.
Was a hockey stick from 2012 that went up.
Yep.
That reminded me of a chart from Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation,
Yep.
where the phones, either the iPhone switched or the social media platforms went to algorithms at that point, and that had a hockey stick chart with mental health pitfall, particularly for young women. I don't know if you have any sense of the irreligiosity of young women and social media and phones. It just reminded me of that other hockey stick chart, 2012, young women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was at a conference where a Christian venture capitalist was there, and he said the worst thing that we ever created in Silicon Valley was algorithmically fed vertical video. You guys know what that is? That's TikTok, which is now Reels, which is now Shorts, it's killed our attention span. And it's a lot of, I don't even watch TikTok. I try to not be like one of these living this pure life. I don't do TikTok. After he told me that, I really started thinking about what it was doing to my brain and go, I don't need that in my life. That is not how we communicate with each other. I think we have unleashed maybe the largest social experiment ever on the youngest generation, and just now we're figuring out what that means. With the phones. I mean, I don't think there's not been a technological change as much as there has been in the last 15 years. Steve Jobs broke us. And I don't think he realized, and Mark Zuckerberg did too. I think we don't fully realize how much that's changed, how the classic graph is how do married couples meet? It used to be church and, the neighborhood. The number one way the young couples meet now is online. It's completely changed everything about American life. And young people don't have the same brain development that we do because they grew up with this different world. I don't think there's an easy answer. I don't know how we fix it. I think every state in the union should pass a cell phone ban in the classroom. The evidence on that is overwhelming. No cell phones in the class. And I think colleges, I actually have several professor friends who say the best thing they ever did was say no electronics in the classroom. No more laptops, no more phones out. You can have it in your pocket, obviously, but don't have it out. Take notes with paper and pencil and be fully engaged. They complain at the beginning so much, but by week 10 or 12, they're like, wow, I'm learning more in this class than I ever learned in any other class. Because we are weak individuals, and if I can be distracted, I will be distracted, so take away the distractions. We need to be more proactive, and I think colleges and universities need to be more thoughtful about our electronics policy. Not just done at the individual professor level, but done at the university level. I think that actually might be a huge attractant for some college students. If you advertise, we do not allow electronics in the classroom, I think a certain subset of students will be like, I want that. Let me try that,
So early on, you connected maybe the potentially the change in women's religious attitudes and participation to politics.
Yeah.
And I know that one of the keys to President Obama's victories was in kind of recognizing unmarried women as a major resource that can be mobilized. What I'm curious about is there potentially a change in the opposite direction with sort of all the transgender and men and women's sports kind of backlash?
I think listen, we all can agree the vibe shifted in the last year or two. You know, we went through, I think we're going to look back and go like the George Floyd period was a weird period in American history where we all got, well, every major institutions wanted to do something about racism, right? They wanted to, did you guys know at the Super Bowl, they've had end racism in the end zone now for the last 5 years? They're taking it out this year. They're not putting it on the grass where it says end racism at the end of the end zone. The vibe has shifted on this. And I think, here's what I think has happened. One explanation for why young men are coming back to religion is, I think that they saw a culture that rapidly shifted on issues of sexuality and gender in a way they weren't comfortable with. You know, if you think about like the gay marriage movement, that movement like really took like 25 years to get where it got, to get Obergefell passed. And all of a sudden we're like, no, men can play women's sports. You know, it just moved really, really fast. And I think a lot of young men are going, I don't know if I feel good about this. Why don't I feel good about this? And I think someone goes, maybe religion would help explain why I feel uncomfortable about what's going on in America. And I know this is kind of like a very cynical explanation, but they actually use religion as sort of a justification for why they feel the way they do. So it wasn't religion came first, and then that changed their minds. It was their minds changed, and then they were looking for, it can't be I hate trans people. It's got to be because you know, the Bible says there's man and woman. That's a much more socially acceptable reason to say those things. Not saying that every man came back to church because of that, but I think it was part of it. It was part of the conversation, is this conservative shift among young men and the liberal shift among young women. We don't fully understand all that yet, but I think it's having huge implications for American society. Yeah.
Ryan, thank you so much. This has been very, very interesting and very helpful. My question is kind of in the same vein as the last question, but a little bit different.
Yeah.
According to the organization, the research that we've done in my organization, we feel that the young men, college-age young men, were most conservative politically, I'm not saying theologically or biblically, but conservative politically in the last 50 years, college-age men. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if your research would bear that out based on what you're saying.
I think yes. I think that what you're seeing is that young men are very much, I think it actually might be two things at once. They're actually rejecting the larger cultural shift to the left, but I also think they're one is distance themselves from the women becoming very liberal too at the same time. It's almost like for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction the other way. And I think this is actually a real problem, by the way, because what we know, there's a social science concept called homophily. It's the idea that you want to be around people like you, so you marry people that are similar to you. Well, guess what? If you're a young conservative Trump voting guy on a college campus, good luck. You know, you're going to have a really hard time finding a homophily mate that's in the same political sphere. Maybe on a Christian campus it's easier. Obviously it is, because MRS degree was very popular at Greenville. I knew lots of couples who did that. But in a public university like where I teach is, I mean, the young women tend to be the most liberal people on campus, and the young men tend to either be quiet or conservative. Quietly conservative, you know? So I think that's the bigger problem that I worry about, is this growing like gender divide. When we're worried about things like the marital rate declining and fertility declining, that's going to make it worse because we're going to be on different planets from each other. But I have to make this point. Young people, especially young white people, do not have any concept of religion that's not conservative. Just hold that idea in your head for a minute. They don't have any concept of the civil rights movement. You know, they were born in the 1990s or 2000s. They don't understand that, you know, John Lewis and Martin Luther King were driven by religious faith. The progressive era in America was driven by whom? Christians who wanted to do things like child labor laws and overtime rules, right? To give more people power at the ballot box through progressive, like referendums and initiatives. The abolitionist movement was driven by white Christians in the North who thought that slavery was completely incompatible with the Bible. The only religious movement that my students are aware of is the religious right. They don't have any concept of religion that's not conservative. And I think that is a real problem. I think that, and this is my book for Brazos coming out next year, is like American religion used to have left, right, and center in it, especially white American religion, and now it doesn't. And what that's doing is pushing out a lot of young people who are moderate or left of center, who would have been Christians 30 years ago, but now can't find a church. And I think that's bad. And I think Christian colleges should model what political debate looks like left, right, and center, making the best version of each argument so students hear it well articulated on both sides. Because I think young people, they're not rejecting Christianity. They're rejecting the idea that Christianity has to be conservative. They just don't understand Christianity that's not conservative. And I think that's a real problem. It's the first time in American history that's been true, at least in the last 200 years. And I think part of the job of professors like me is to say, hey, it's not always been like this. That's a lot of what I do in the classroom, by the way, is go, it's not always been like this, you know, because they have an attention span and a history that goes back 10 years, 15 years, not 50 years or 100 years. So, question?
Thank you for your presentation. This is my students, and I see it in my family where my niece was born literally 1 month after 9/11, and then graduated high school 2020 and lost all those rites of passages in there. I think the Wall Street Journal recently had an article that says 30-somethings today are not reaching typical milestones like family, marriage, career, those types of things. So if you can play a little forecaster, how do you see this generation being, say, when they hit their 50s, and what impact will that have on the generations coming behind?
You're going to see a lot of people regret not getting married and having families. It's too late. You know, no one's telling young people that, like, fertility doesn't go forever. Like, they're like, oh, I know so-and-so, the actress, she had a baby at 52. That could be me. No, it shouldn't be you. That's actually really bad biologically to have baby. Did you guys know fertility drops after 35 precipitously? Like, that's facts. That's scientific facts. And yet more and more people think, well, I'll have a kid after I do this or after I do that. That, to me, is what really, really worries me, is all the regret those people are going to feel when they're 50 years old and did not get married or did not have kids, have a great career, make a ton of money, but what are you going to do with all that money? What I worry about with Gen Z especially is I think you have to have an adolescence one way or another. That's a pet theory I have. And either you have it when you're an adolescent or you have it later on in life. And that's not good when you have a lot of money. You know what I mean? Like, now you got too much ammo to do dumb things with. When you're 16, you don't have any, thank God. But when you're 46 and make, 6 figures, that's not good. These midlife crises, I think, are going to get worse. They're going to last longer, and they're going to be more destructive because people, when they were 16, 17, did not do those dumb things and get it out of their system. I think that's what I really worry about, is how do you go to a 50-year-old and go, get your stuff together, dude? Like, stop being dumb, you know? Well, I didn't get to party when I was 18 because of COVID, so I'm going to party now. I mean, here's what I always know about social science, though. We call it long cycle theory. Like, the pendulum swings in social science, okay? If you look at international relations, we went through a long period of war, and then we've gone through a long period of peace. And you see that consistently across the entire sweep of Western civilization. I think what you're also going to see that with politically, we're seeing that right now too, by the way. We swung to the left, now we're swinging to the right. I think what we're going to see with young people is the technology took them over, and then there's going to be a next generation that says, wait, hold on. Let's figure out a way to have a healthy relationship with technology and go back the other way. Not be Luddites, right? Not be like, no, we're not going to have phones, but have them in a way that's not destructive to their relationships. It actually enhances their face-to-face communications and relationships. I think we're on the cusp. Like I said with my 10-year-old, I think he's already seeing it at 10 that he doesn't want to be an iPad kid. I think the youngest, like 8, 10, 12-year-old kids are going to be better off than the kids who are 18 now because they saw it. They saw what happened to their older siblings, and they don't want it to happen to them. And I'm also being very optimistic here, to be fair. Maybe it gets worse, but I pray to God it doesn't, because this is not good for us. Yeah. Last one.
You mentioned that putting the screens down, talking with people is important. I think we would all agree, especially in the church, that mentorship, discipleship really is face-to-face. But most of our schools, if not all of our schools, have online education, asynchronous online education. And how does that fit with what you're saying about this?
So whenever I started at EIU, we did not have any online classes, and now we have an entire online grad program that I administer. And you know why we have that online grad program? Because there was a huge demand for it. I think there's something we need to talk about when maybe you don't want to give people what they want. You know what I mean? Maybe you don't want to give people what they want, the easiest, fastest, simplest education they could possibly get, and that might be the worst thing they can possibly get. But unfortunately, money talks, right? And budgets have to be balanced. And the way it's been described to me is, well, it's not like these students would have gone to get a master's degree if they had no online programs. They would have not gotten a master's degree at all. So the alternative is no degree or an online degree, not no degree or an in-person degree. And an online degree is better than no degree at all. I buy that to an extent, but I also think colleges need to not always do the easy thing. I think that's the problem is Americans default to the easy thing. And I think institutions have been set up to say, maybe we should do it a little bit harder next time. Maybe we should make it more difficult. Maybe we should make 30 hours instead of 33 hours, or come to campus at least a little bit. I think the online education thing has actually just made everything I talked about worse. And I think online church is probably not helping at all either, FYI, to take a shot at all that thing. You know the people who are the most likely to watch online church are? The people who go to church in person every week. The share of Americans who don't go in person but watch online every week is 5%. That's the online, 5% is the online audience. I just don't know if that's worth it at the end of the day. There's something about being with people, embodied in a room of people. It's like nothing. I can say the creed in my office by myself and it means nothing. But when I go in a room with a bunch of other Christians and we say the creed together and our voices all have the same timbre and pitch and speed and tempo, there's nothing like that on planet Earth. I remember at Greenville, we had chapel Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I went to chapel Monday, Wednesday, Friday, went to Vespers on Thursday night. There was nothing on earth that felt like when we sang the doxology together. I still think about that at 42 years old, what I did 20 years ago. We have to remind students that there's something powerful about being in physical community with each other. It's salvific in a way. It was for me at some points in my life. It saved me from my worst impulses. And I think we've got to figure out a way to rebuild that which was lost. This fragmented culture that we have, this atomized culture that we have, obviously is not doing us any favors, and especially not doing Gen Z any favors. Colleges and universities are one of the very last bastions of social capital, and that togetherness, man, you're so important. Don't forget that. And not just to the kingdom, by the way, but also to American society and American democracy. Your mission is bigger than that. Don't forget that you're doing such good things for students. It's such an important part of their lives. And by them sitting in your classroom every week, every day, you're building those relationships that they will carry them through next 20, 30, 40 years. There's nothing more beautiful on earth than that. So I affirm what you guys are doing. I'm so glad you guys exist and continue to do it. Thank you so much.